The horse was already gone when she found the note. Vera Briggs stood in the doorway of the livery stable, her hands trembling, the folded piece of paper pressed so hard against her palm that the ink might have bled through her skin and into her bloodstream. Outside, the sun was hammering down on the dust of Caldwell, Kansas, the way it always did in late August of 1878, indifferent and brutal, like everything else in this part of the country. The stall where the black stallion had stood for 3 weeks was empty. The straw was still pressed down in the shape of him. The feed bucket was still hanging from its iron hook, half full of oats he would never eat now. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was rough, angular, like a man who had learned to write from a wanted poster and never improved much past that point. It said, "Sold the horse to Emmett Farrow at the trading post. He gave me $11. I left 8 of it under the loose board behind the cook stove. It should cover you through the end of October if you are careful. Do not thank me. Do not come looking. Q." Vera read it twice. Then she pressed it against her mouth and stood very still, the way she had learned to hold herself together when everything inside her wanted to come apart. $8. He had sold the only thing he had left in this world that mattered to him. The horse he called Cinder, the animal that had carried him across 4 states and out of more trouble than either of them probably survived to remember. And he had given her $8 and told her not to thank him. She looked at the stall again. The emptiness of it felt like a held breath that no one was ever going to let out. She had known Quinn Jared for 23 days. It had started the way everything difficult and consequential seemed to start in her life, without her permission and without any particular warning. It was the first week of August, and Vera had been standing in front of the dry goods store on Main Street with 37 cents in her pocket, which was everything she owned, and a list in her hand of the things she needed to survive the week. The list and the 37 cents did not agree with each other at all. She had been doing the arithmetic in her head for the 3rd time, trying to find a different answer, when she heard the sound that the whole town heard at roughly the same moment. A single gunshot, then shouting, then the particular thundering silence that follows violence in a small place where everyone knows everyone and the echo of a bullet means something personal. She had not looked up from her list immediately. She had learned that looking up too quickly in Caldwell was a way of drawing attention you did not want, and Vera Briggs had spent the better part of her 26 years learning to make herself small and invisible in places that were not inclined to be kind to a woman alone. She had been alone for 14 months. She had been managing. She had not been thriving, but she had been managing, which in 1878 in a cattle town in southern Kansas was sometimes the most you could ask of a given Tuesday. Then the drought hit in July and burned the garden to its roots, and by the first week of August, she was standing in front of the dry goods store with 37 cents and a list that required at least $1.50, and the arithmetic kept coming out wrong. The commotion resolved itself. She heard boots on the boardwalk and turned her head just enough to see a man being walked at gunpoint across the street by the town marshal, a large and humorless man named Dale Whitmore. Behind Marshal Whitmore walked another man, one she did not recognize, moving with the particular economy of motion that she would later come to understand was not calmness, but rather the opposite of it. A kind of coiled readiness that had been held so long it had stopped looking like tension and started looking like stillness. He was tall, lean in the way that men who do not always know where their next meal is coming from tend to be lean, with dark hair that had grown past the point of intentional style and into the territory of simple neglect. His coat was the color of dried blood, a deep rust brown that had probably been black once. He wore a gun on his left hip, which she noticed because most men in Caldwell wore theirs on the right, and his hands were loose at his sides with the fingers slightly spread, the way hands looked when they were practiced at reaching for things quickly. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the marshal, and the man the marshal had in hand, and his expression was the expression of someone completing a transaction they had started and wanted finished. Then he turned his head and looked directly at her list. "You got too much on that paper for what's in your pocket," he said. She looked up sharply. "Excuse me. I'm not trying to be rude about it," he said. He nodded toward the paper. "I can see the list from here and I can see you counting. The numbers don't match." She folded the list. "That is not your concern." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He stood there for a moment in the way a man stands when he is deciding something. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a coin. He held it out toward her. It was a silver dollar. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," he said. "I just brought a wanted man into Marshal Whitmore's custody, and he is going to pay me a $5 bounty for it. I have more money right now than I've had in 3 months. That dollar won't change my situation any. Your situation is different." "You don't know anything about my situation." "I know enough." He set the dollar on the edge of the boardwalk railing between them, not pressing it into her hand, not forcing the thing on her, just leaving it there in a place where she could take it or leave it as she chose. "I'm Quinn Jared. I'm staying at the Drover's Inn for a few days while my horse rests. If you want to pay it back someday when things are better, you can find me and do that. If things don't get better, then consider it gone and don't think about it anymore." He walked away before she could argue any further. She stood there for a moment staring at the coin on the railing. A woman named Clara Hicks from the Methodist Church walked past and gave the coin, and then Vera a look that communicated several opinions simultaneously, all of them unwelcome. Vera picked up the coin and went into the dry goods store. She told herself she would find him and pay it back within the week. That was what she told herself. The truth was more complicated, and the truth began the following afternoon when she was carrying laundry back from the river, and the wooden crate she was using slipped and cracked on a rock, and 3 weeks' worth of other people's clean clothes went into the mud at the edge of the bank. She did not cry. She had not cried since Thomas died, partly because she had discovered that crying used energy she could not spare, and partly because there was no one to cry to, which made the whole exercise feel embarrassingly theatrical. She sat down on a dry rock, and she looked at the ruined laundry, and she thought very carefully and methodically about what she was going to do next. "You need another hand." She looked up, and there he was again. Quinn Jared, standing on the bank 10 feet away with his horse, that large black stallion whose existence she would only later fully appreciate, drinking from the river. He was looking at the scattered laundry with an expression that was not pity, which she appreciated, but rather assessment. "The clothes need to be rewashed," she said. "I can see that. I don't have time to rewash them today and still return them by morning, which is when they are expected. I'll help you wash them," he said. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that she spent a full 3 seconds waiting for the condition attached to it. There was no condition. He looped his horse's reins around a branch and rolled up his sleeves and walked down to the water. They washed clothes for 2 hours in the river, side by side, not talking much for the first hour and then talking steadily for the second. He found out that she was 26, that she had come to Caldwell with Thomas from Ohio 4 years ago, because Thomas had believed the stories about opportunity in the West, that she had one sister back in Columbus whom she wrote to but could not afford to visit, that she had been good at mathematics in school and had always believed this would be useful somehow, and was still waiting for that to be proven true, and that she was afraid of rattlesnakes, but not of much else. He laughed at the last part. It was not a performed laugh, not the social laugh of a man trying to be charming. It was genuine and a little surprised, and it changed his whole face when it happened, opened something up that the rest of the time was shut very firmly closed. She noticed that. She noticed it and then looked away from it, because noticing things like that was not something she could afford right now. He helped her carry the laundry back to her house, which was a small wooden structure at the east end of town, with a kitchen garden in the back that was presently a collection of dried stems and cracked earth. He saw the garden without commenting on it, which told her he understood what it meant without needing to say so. "Thank you," she said at her door. "Don't mention it," he said, in a tone that suggested he meant it literally. He came back the next day with firewood. She had not asked for firewood. He set it on her porch and knocked on her door, and when she opened it, he said, "There's a man at the river cutting cord wood and selling it for 2 cents a bundle. I bought you 3 bundles." He handed her the change from the purchase, exact to the penny, which she understood was his way of being clear that this was a transaction and not an act of condescension. She invited him in for coffee. It was the only thing she had to offer. He sat at her kitchen table and drank the coffee, and they talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with either of their circumstances, which was itself a kind of relief, like setting down something heavy for a little while. He told her about a canyon in New Mexico he had ridden through that was so red it looked like riding through the inside of a fire. She told him about the first winter she and Thomas had spent in Caldwell, when the snow had come up to the windowsills, and the town had gone completely quiet for 2 weeks, and she had felt, for the first time in her adult life, something approaching contentment. "You loved him," Quinn said. "Not a question." "I did," she said. "He was a good man. He was not a practical man, but he was good, and that counted for more than I gave it credit for at the time." Quinn nodded slowly. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I never had that," he said. "Someone to love, I mean. Someone who stayed." She looked at him directly for the first time since he had sat down. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes in a way that was partly sun and partly something harder to name, but there was nothing closed about his expression in that moment. He was looking down at his coffee cup with a kind of unguarded honesty that she suspected he did not show very often. "You never tried?" she asked. "I tried once," he said. "She left. I don't blame her. My life is not the kind of life a person can build something next to." "Your life could be different," she said. He looked up at her then. "Could it?" he said. It was not quite a question. She did not answer it. She refilled his coffee cup and changed the subject to whether the drought was going to break before September, which it was not going to, though neither of them knew that yet. He kept coming back. That was the thing. He had told her he was staying a few days, and the few days stretched into a week, and then 2 weeks. And every day he found some small way to be useful that did not insult her independence. He fixed the hinge on her gate. He replaced 2 boards on her porch that had started to rot. He found a buyer for a piece of embroidery she had made and not known how to sell, and he got 3 times what she would have asked for it, which infuriated and delighted her in equal measure. "You didn't have to do that," she told him. "The embroidery was worth what I got for it," he said. "You were going to undersell yourself. You don't know what I would have asked. You would have asked $1. I got 3. She stared at him. "How did you know I would have asked $1? Because you price everything you do too low," he said. "You're used to people not valuing what you offer." He said it without cruelty and without particular emphasis, just as a fact he had observed, and the accuracy of it hit her somewhere in the chest with a force she had not been prepared for. She looked away. "That is an uncomfortably perceptive thing to say." "I've been watching you," he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. "Not in a strange way. I just mean that I've been paying attention to how you manage, to what you're dealing with." "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through her kitchen window at a low angle, lighting the side of his face, and she could see the muscle in his jaw working. "Because you interest me," he said finally. "Because you're the first person I've met in a long time who doesn't want anything from me that I'd feel bad about giving." The silence after that was the particular kind that happens when something has been said that neither person is quite ready to respond to. Vera turned back to the bread she was making, pressing her hands into the dough, and Quinn sat at her table with his coffee going cold, and neither of them said anything for several minutes, and it was not an uncomfortable silence at all. That was the thing that kept surprising her. The silences with him were not uncomfortable. She had spent 14 months surrounded by silences that felt like accusations, like the absence of Thomas and the absence of money and the absence of any clear path forward, were all conspiring to make every quiet moment feel like a judgment. With Quinn, the silence felt different. It felt like company. She was aware that this was dangerous. She was aware of it the way you are aware of walking near the edge of something, not afraid but careful, keeping your center of gravity properly positioned. It was at the end of his second week in Caldwell that she found out about the debt. She had been at the merchant bank. In Preston, Holt's narrow office with its smell of paper and stale ambition, attempting to negotiate an extension on the $42 debt that Thomas had left behind. Holt was not an openly cruel man, which in some ways made him harder to deal with than if he had been. He was simply inflexible, the way a certain kind of small authority makes a man inflexible, because flexibility would require him to acknowledge that his rules were not the same thing as justice. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, looking at his ledger rather than at her, "the terms of the original note are quite clear. The balance of $42 was due in full on the 1st of August. We are now 2 weeks past that date." "I am aware of that," she said. "I am asking for an extension to the 1st of November, 3 months. I will have found additional income by then." From what source? She had several answers to this question, and none of them were solid enough to withstand Holt's scrutiny. She said the most honest thing: "I am working on it." Holt closed his ledger. "Mrs. Briggs, the bank is not in the business of extending credit indefinitely to borrowers who cannot demonstrate repayment capacity. If you cannot repay by the end of August, I will be obligated to begin proceedings on the property." "It's a house," she said. "It is where I live." "It is collateral on a debt," he said. "Those are not incompatible descriptions." She walked out of the bank into the hammering August sunlight and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her hands pressed flat against her sides, breathing evenly, refusing to let the panic move past her ribcage. Quinn was across the street, outside the blacksmith's, watching Cinder get a shoe reset. He saw her come out of the bank and the look on her face, and he crossed the street without being asked. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She did not mean to tell him all of it, but once she started, it came out in its entirety: the debt, the drought, the ruined garden, Holt's deadline, the arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. She told it quickly and without ornamentation, the way you tell something when you are not looking for sympathy but simply need to say it out loud to be certain it is real. Quinn listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much time do you have?" he asked. He said end of August. "That's 2 weeks. And you need $42. I need $42, which I do not have, and no realistic way to get." He looked at the bank across the street. His expression was not angry exactly, but it was hard in a way she had not seen from him before. Does he own the note outright, or is he acting as agent for someone else? She blinked. I don't know. Why does that matter? Because if someone else holds the note, there might be room to negotiate around Holt. If Holt owns it himself, he's the only one you need to persuade. He paused. I'll look into it. Quinn, she said, I am not asking you to solve this for me. I know you're not, he said. I'm offering. I don't want your money, she said firmly. I don't have $42 to give you, he said equally firmly, so that's not what I'm offering. I'm offering to look into it. That's all. He found out that afternoon that the note was held by a land speculator named Albert Crane in Wichita, who had purchased several bad debts from the Caldwell Bank as investments, and that Holt was collecting on Crane's behalf for a fee. He found out further, through a conversation with the blacksmith's apprentice who had a gift for gossip and no particular loyalty to anyone, that Crane had bought the note for $22, meaning that any settlement above that amount was profit to him. He came to her house that evening and explained this. So he might take $30 as settlement, Vera said. He might take $25, Quinn said, and he might take it in installments if someone could guarantee the payments. Who would guarantee the payments? Quinn looked at her steadily. I could. You are a bounty hunter with no fixed address and a horse as your primary asset, she said. No offense meant, none taken, that's accurate. He leaned back in his chair. But I have a reputation in this part of Kansas. Marshal Whitmore will vouch for me. That counts for something with a business type like Crane. Men like that respect established authority. This is an enormous amount of trouble for someone you've known 3 weeks, she said. Yes, he said. Why? He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight of her small house, and this time he did not look away and he did not change the subject. He said, Vera, I think you know why. The silence that followed was different from the earlier comfortable ones. This one had weight and direction, and a current running through it that she could feel against her skin like the air before a storm. She said carefully, Quinn, you don't have to say anything back, he said. I'm not asking you to say anything. I'm just being honest with you because I think you're someone who deserves honesty and doesn't get enough of it. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Thomas, about the 14 months of managing alone, about the garden burned to nothing, about Preston Holt's ledger and his flat, procedural voice. She thought about a woman who had told herself for a year that she did not need anyone and had been right about that and wrong about it at the same time. I'm not ready, she said finally. I don't know if I will be. That's a fair answer, he said, and he meant it. She could tell. He spent the next 3 days writing letters. He wrote to Albert Crane in Wichita, making the case for a reduced settlement and installment payments. He wrote to Marshal Whitmore requesting a letter of character reference. He wrote to 2 other men, former associates whose names he did not mention, who he said might have information about Crane's other business interests that could be useful in a negotiation. She did not ask him to do this. She did not tell him to stop. She watched him sit at her kitchen table in the evenings with paper and ink, his large hands moving carefully over the words, his tongue pressed slightly to the inside of his cheek when he was concentrating. And she felt something shifting in the part of her that she had kept locked since Thomas's funeral. She began to notice things about him. The way he always checked on Cinder before he sat down to eat, going to the livery stable where he was boarding the horse and spending 10 minutes just making sure the animal was all right, brushing him down sometimes for no reason other than that the horse seemed to appreciate it. The way he listened when she talked, not with the impatient half-listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but with full attention, his dark eyes steady on her face, remembering things she said and bringing them back in later conversations. The way he laughed, still rare, still unguarded when it came, like a door opening briefly on a room that was warmer than the rest of the house. One afternoon, she came back from returning laundry to find him on her porch, talking to a woman named Mee Fuller, who ran the boarding house at the north end of Main Street. Mee was approximately 40 years old, sharp-tongued and kind-hearted in the manner of women who have learned that one of those qualities without the other is useless. She was telling Quinn in some detail about a situation involving a broken water pump and a guest who had left without paying, and Quinn was listening to her the same way he listened to Vera, with that full and genuine attention. "Your man here fixed my pump," Mee told Vera when she came up the steps. "He's not my man," Vera said. Said Mee in a tone that contained an entire editorial. Quinn said nothing. He was looking at the middle distance with an expression of careful neutrality. Later, when Mee had gone, Vera said, "You fixed her pump." "It was a simple fix," he said. "The coupling was just worn." "You've been fixing things for half the town," she said. It was true. In the weeks he had been in Caldwell, he had, through no particular plan, helped the blacksmith with a structural problem in his chimney, carried supplies for the elderly Mennonite couple at the end of Main Street, assisted a young cowhand whose horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles outside of town, and now repaired Mee Fuller's water pump. He did these things without announcement and without apparent expectation of return. "It passes the time," he said. "Quinn," she said, "tell me something true." He looked at her. "What kind of true? About why you're still here? You've been in Caldwell 3 weeks. You said you were staying a few days. The bounty was paid 2 weeks ago. Tell me why you're still here." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I keep finding reasons not to leave." "What reasons?" "You," he said, "just that. One word, simple and direct and irrevocable." She sat down on the porch step. He sat beside her, not close but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. "I have not been fair to you," she said. "How do you mean?" "I have let you help me. I have let you sit in my kitchen and drink my coffee and fix my gate and write letters on my behalf. And every time you have indicated that you feel something, I have deflected it without being honest about why." He waited. "I am afraid," she said. "Not of you. Of needing someone again and losing them. Thomas did not choose to leave, but he left, and the leaving nearly undid me. Not the grief exactly. The grief I could manage. The sudden absence of a person who knew all the particular details of your life, who knew where you kept things and how you took your coffee and what you talked about when you couldn't sleep. That kind of leaving." Quinn was silent for a while after that. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire somewhere in the elm tree at the corner of her lot, cycling through a dozen different borrowed songs. "I understand that fear," he said finally. "I've been the one doing the leaving for most of my life. I know what it looks like from the outside, and I know it doesn't look like much when you're the one going, but I understand what it takes from the person who stays." "Could you stop leaving?" she asked. It was the most direct thing she had said to him, and she felt the vulnerability of it like an exposed nerve. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never tried. I don't know what I'd be without it, but I know that I don't want to leave here. I know that's true. I've known it for about 2 weeks. She looked at him. In the fading evening light, with the mockingbird cycling through its songs and the dust of Caldwell settling around them, he looked like a man who was telling the truth, and was a little frightened by it. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. Just for a moment, then she took it back. He exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "All right." The response from Albert Crane came 8 days later. Crane was willing to accept a settlement of $30, to be paid in 2 installments, $15 in September and $15 in October. Given that Vera's laundry work typically brought her $5 to $7 a month, this was still an enormous challenge, but it was possible in a way that the full $42 had not been. Quinn brought her the letter on a Tuesday morning and sat at her kitchen table while she read it. When she looked up, his expression was careful, waiting. "This is because of your guarantee," she said. "It's because of your situation and a reasonable business calculation," he said. "Crane doesn't want to deal with a prolonged legal situation over a small property in a Kansas cattle town. $30 is clean. It's still because you vouched for it." "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply and meant it fully. He nodded once, accepting the thanks in the spirit it was offered. It was 3 days after that letter arrived that he sold the horse. She did not know he was going to do it. She had been calculating and recalculating her laundry income, trying to determine whether she could make $15 by the 1st of September, and the answer kept coming out just short. 10, maybe $11 if she took on extra work, and if the summer's end didn't slow the rancher's needs the way it sometimes did. She was $4 or $5 short, and she had been lying awake thinking about it with the patient, grinding anxiety that had become the background music of her life. She had not told Quinn she was short. She had told him the settlement was accepted, and she would manage the payments. She had believed she would find a way. She had not found a way. And Quinn had found one for her. $11 from Emmett Farrow at the trading post for cinder. $8 under the floorboard behind her cook stove. $3 presumably kept for himself, for food and incidentals, for the immediate necessities of a man now without a horse in a territory where a horse was not a luxury, but the difference between being able to move and being stationary. She pulled up the loose board behind the cook stove. The money was there, $8 in coins and small bills, wrapped in a piece of cloth she recognized as having been cut from the lining of his coat. She sat down on the kitchen floor with the money in her hands. He had sold Cinder. He had sold the horse he had traveled across 4 states with, the animal he checked on before every meal, that he had brushed down for no reason other than affection. That was the single substantial asset standing between Quinn Jared and destitution in the Wild West. And he had done it without telling her, and left the note so she would not have to watch it happen. Because she would have stopped him. He had known she would have stopped him, and he had not given her the chance, because he had decided that her being housed and fed through October was more important than whatever she might have felt about his methods of ensuring it. She pressed the cloth-wrapped money against her sternum, and thought about the particular texture of a sacrifice made without requiring acknowledgement. The ones performed in the dark and left where you will find them later, when the person who made them is already gone. She had told him not to come looking. She went looking anyway. She found him at Mee Fuller's boarding house, which was both predictable and not. He had been staying at the Drover's Inn, which was cheaper, but Mee Fuller had apparently offered him a room at cost when word got around about the pump repair. And Quinn had accepted because the Drover's Inn had asked him to leave when it became apparent that he was no longer a paying customer in the conventional sense, and was now a man who had sold his horse and was waiting to figure out his next step. Mee let her in without any commentary beyond a look that communicated both approval and a carefully maintained pretense of neutrality. Quinn was in the small room at the back of the 2nd floor. The door was open, and he was sitting in a wooden chair by the window, cleaning his gun with the automatic thoroughness of long habit, not looking out the window or at anything in particular, just moving through the familiar motions of maintenance in the way people do when their hands need to be busy so their mind does not have to be. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. She held up the cloth-wrapped money and his note. Something moved across his face. It was not quite guilt and not quite relief and not quite embarrassment. It was more complicated than any of those things. "I told you not to come looking," he said. Yes, you did, she said. She walked into the room and sat down on the edge of the bed because there was no other chair. You told me not to thank you either, Vera. So I'm not thanking you, she said. I'm sitting here and I am going to tell you some things, and you are going to listen to them without interrupting, and then we will figure out what comes next. Can you do that? He set the gun down on the windowsill. He turned in his chair to face her properly. I'm listening, he said. You sold your horse, she said. I did. You sold Cinder, who you have traveled with for, based on what you told me, at least 4 years. You sold the only significant thing you owned in the world. You sold your ability to move across this territory and earn money doing the work you know how to do. You did all of that so I would have enough money to get through October. The arithmetic worked out, he said. Quinn. It did. I checked it 3 times. Stop, she said. I'm not angry at you. I want to be because it would be simpler, but I'm not. What I am is. She stopped. She breathed. What I am is someone who is sitting here looking at a man who gave up the most important thing in his life for me after knowing me for 3 weeks, and trying to understand what I am supposed to do with that. He was very still. I told you I was afraid, she said. I told you I was afraid of needing someone and losing them. And I meant that, and it's still true. But I've been lying awake this week doing the arithmetic on my situation, and I keep coming to the same answer, which is that I am already afraid of losing you. I am already doing it. Which means whatever I was trying to protect myself from, I did not protect myself from it. You got through anyway. The silence in the room was immense and specific. Outside, Caldwell was doing its afternoon business. Horses and voices and the distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer, indifferent to the fact that something significant was happening in the back room of Me Fuller's boarding house. Quinn stood up from his chair. He crossed the small space between them in 2 steps and crouched down in front of her so that their eyes were level. I didn't sell Cinder to manipulate you, he said. I want you to know that. I didn't do it to create an obligation or to force anything. I did it because you needed it and I had it, and the choice was obvious to me, even if it wasn't simple. I know that, she said. That's precisely the problem. How is that a problem? Because a man who makes obvious choices like that is impossible to stay sensibly afraid of, she said. His mouth curved, not the rare full laugh but the precursor to it, the slight softening of a face that had been held carefully composed for too long. Is that right? It is extremely inconvenient, she confirmed. He reached up and took her hand, slowly and carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull back. She did not pull back. Here is what I can tell you, he said. I am 31 years old, and I have spent the last 14 years moving from one place to the next, and never staying anywhere long enough to want to stay. I have done things I'm not proud of, and survived things that probably should have gone differently. I have been a Confederate soldier and a bounty hunter, and at least 3 other things I won't mention right now, and none of it has made me particularly proud of the life I've been living. She was listening. His hand was warm around hers. But I have been in Caldwell for 3 weeks, he said, and for the first time in a long time, I have been looking forward to tomorrow. I have been going to sleep at night thinking about tomorrow and what it might contain, specifically whether it might contain you and your kitchen and your coffee, and that way you look at me when I say something true that you didn't expect. She looked at him. I would like to stay, he said. Not just through October. I would like to stay the way people stay when they mean it, if that is something you can consider. You don't have a horse, she said. No, you don't have income at the moment. That's temporary. I can do work here. I've already demonstrated that. I'm good with horses, which in a cattle town is a marketable quality. The blacksmith asked me yesterday if I wanted to help him while his apprentice is sick. I'm reasonably good with a hammer. I'm not without options. Quinn. Yes. I am considering it, she said. I want you to understand that I am genuinely considering it, but I need you to understand what you would be staying for. It is not romantic, the actual situation. It is a small house and a debt and laundry work and a burned garden and a town that is moderately kind when it remembers to be. It is not adventure. It is not the open road or whatever your life has been before this. Vera, he said, my life before this was lonely. I would trade every mile of open road I've ever ridden for something that mattered in one place. She held his gaze for a long moment. Everything in her that had been wound tight for 14 months was very slowly releasing, like a rope coming off a cleat, like something that had been held in place by effort alone, finding that the effort was no longer necessary. All right, she said. Then stay. She did not kiss him then. It was not the right moment for that, and they both seemed to understand it without discussion. But she held his hand and he stayed crouched in front of her, and outside, Caldwell continued its afternoon, and something between them settled into a new shape that felt, carefully and tentatively, and with the full awareness of all the ways it might still go wrong, like the beginning of something solid. September arrived, and with it a change in the air that was not quite relief from the heat, but was at least the suggestion that relief was on its way. Quinn went to work for Hector Brody, the blacksmith, covering for the sick apprentice, and discovering in the process that he had more aptitude for the work than either of them had expected. Brody, a German immigrant who had been in Kansas since before the war and had an encyclopedic knowledge of what work was worth, paid him 40 cents a day, which was honest and fair. Quinn paid me fuller for his room from his first week, wages, and moved back to the Drover's Inn when a room opened there for 30 cents a week, partly to save money and partly because me Fuller's knowing looks had become something he experienced as a benign but persistent pressure he did not quite know how to inhabit. He and Vera fell into a pattern. She brought him lunch at the blacksmith's on the days she was passing that way on laundry runs, and he came to her house in the evenings 3 or 4 times a week, and they cooked together or sat on her porch in the cooling dark and talked, working through the particular archaeology of two people who are learning each other's full dimensions. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the war, about a specific battle in Missouri when he was 17 that he had never found a way to think about that did not end badly. About the woman he had mentioned before, whose name was Ella, who had waited 2 years for him to come back from the immediate aftermath of the war, and had finally married someone else, sensibly and correctly, because Quinn had not been able to tell her he was coming back until he understood himself where he was going. She told him about the early months of her marriage, the ones she had not talked about with anyone because they were complicated in a way that grief is supposed to make irrelevant. How Thomas's optimism had been wonderful to be near but difficult to live inside. How she had sometimes felt that his belief that things would always work out had made him careless in ways she was now paying for. "Does it feel disloyal to say that?" he asked. "It used to," she said. "Now it feels like honesty. He was a good man and I loved him, and he was also not particularly careful with money or planning, and both things are true." "That's honest," Quinn said. "You told me once that I deserve honesty and don't get enough of it," she said. "I'm trying to practice it." He looked at her with an expression that was warm and a little bit helpless, the expression of a man who is finding it increasingly difficult to be careful about something he very much wants. The 1st of September came and Vera made her first payment to Albert Crane, $15, through the bank. She had earned $11 from laundry and Quinn had contributed $4 from his blacksmith wages without making a performance of it, setting the bills on her kitchen table one morning with the words, for the payment and nothing else. And she had accepted this in the spirit it was offered, which was partnership. Preston Holt received the payment with the expression of a man who had been somewhat looking forward to a foreclosure and was now required to recalibrate. He stamped the receipt with slightly more force than was strictly necessary. Walking out of the bank into the September sunshine with the receipt in her hand, Vera felt something she had not felt in over a year. It was not happiness exactly, not yet, but it was a cousin of happiness, a sense of the ground under her feet being slightly more solid than it had been that morning. Quinn was waiting outside, leaning against the post at the corner of the boardwalk with his arms crossed, because he had learned the date of the payment and had made no mention of being there but had simply been there. She held up the receipt. He smiled. The full one. The door opening on the warm room. She walked up to him, and, with the September sun on her face and Caldwell going about its business around them, and absolutely no preparation or premeditation whatsoever, she kissed him. It was brief, a single press of her lips to his, over before he had fully registered it was happening. She stepped back. He stared at her. "That was not me thanking you," she said. "What was it then?" "It was me indicating a preference," she said, and walked past him down the boardwalk, and she heard behind her the sound of his laugh, unguarded and genuine and surprised, echoing in the September morning, and she allowed herself to smile where he could not see it. They were careful with each other after that, careful in the way of people who have been hurt before and know the cost of haste. But the carefulness was warm now rather than guarded, a mutual tenderness rather than a mutual defense, and the space between them shifted accordingly. He held her hand walking back from the river one evening. She took his arm when they walked to the church social at the end of September, because Mee Fuller had told her in no uncertain terms that attending the church social would be good for her standing in the community, and that Quinn attending with her would help people recalibrate the various stories they had been quietly assembling. And this turned out to be correct, as Mee Fuller's social intelligence was nearly flawless. The women of the Methodist Church, who had views about most things, had views about Quinn Jared specifically, and those views were initially a mixture of skepticism about his profession, and the somewhat grudging admission that a man who fixed water pumps and helped elderly Mennonite couples and worked honest hours at a blacksmith shop was not easily dismissed as a threat to social order. Clara Hicks, who had seen Vera take the dollar from the railing on that first day, turned out to be the most vocal of the group, and her opinion, once it shifted completely. And she spent the remainder of the social telling everyone within range that she had known from the beginning that Quinn Jared was a man of character. Quinn endured the church social with the patience of a man sitting through something he does not understand, but recognizes as necessary. He drank weak coffee and answered questions about Missouri and his blacksmith work, and whether he had a family. And he was honest about all of it in a way that seemed to alternately puzzle and impress the questioners. "You told them about the bounty hunting," Vera said afterward, walking home in the dark. "I wasn't going to lie about it," he said. "Most men would have." "Most men would have, yes." He paused. "I decided a while ago that hiding what I've been is not the same as changing what I am. If people here are going to accept me, I would rather they accept what's actually true than some version of it I've cleaned up for their comfort." She looked at him in the moonlight. "That is either very admirable or very foolish," she said. "Could be both," he said. She laughed. He had made her laugh. She was realizing that she laughed with some frequency now, which was not something she had expected from this particular year, and the unexpectedness of it was its own kind of gift. He stopped walking. They were on the path between the edge of town and her house, the elm tree ahead of them, the mockingbird quiet for the night. "I want to say something," he said. She turned to face him. "All right." "I know the situation is still complicated," he said. "The second payment is in October. And then after that the debt is settled, but you're still in a house that doesn't belong to you in a town that has not always been generous to you. And my income is steady right now but not established. And I don't have a horse, which is a genuine practical limitation in this part of the world. And I am aware that there are many reasons why the sensible thing to do would be to wait and see before committing to anything permanent." "Yes," she said, "and I know you've said you're afraid, and I know that fear is real, and I'm not dismissing it." "Yes, but I love you," he said. "And I'm not going to wait until the situation is less complicated to say it, because in my experience situations are almost never less complicated, and I would rather say the true thing now than a careful thing later." The night was very quiet around them. Somewhere distant a coyote called and was answered. Vera reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the side of his face, feeling the rough of it under her palm, the realness of him. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for about 3 weeks and it has been extremely inconvenient." He put his arms around her then, and she let herself be held fully and completely, the way she had not let herself be held since before Thomas died, with no part of herself held in reserve, and it felt like coming home to a place she had not known she was looking for. October arrived, and with it the cooler weather and the end of the drought. Rain came in the second week of the month, genuine rain that soaked into the cracked earth and stayed there, and Vera stood on her porch in it with her face up, and felt the specific relief of a person watching a threat that has been present for months finally recede. Quinn made the second payment to Albert Crane himself, riding to the bank on a horse he had borrowed from the blacksmith for the day, which made him feel better about the situation than he expected. He came back with the receipt and the official notation that the debt was settled in full, and he brought it to Vera's kitchen table and set it down between them with the ceremony of a man placing something important in its proper location. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept her important papers, next to Thomas's death certificate and her sister's letters and the piece of embroidery she had never quite managed to sell. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She looked up at him. "What now?" she asked, not anxiously, just genuinely. "I've been thinking about that," he said. He sat down at the table. "Brody wants to take me on permanently. He's been talking about expanding, taking on more horsework, maybe eventually buying out the livery stable owner when he retires. He says he could use a partner who understands animals and isn't afraid of hard work, and that I've demonstrated both of those things." "That's real," she said. "It is. It's actual work in an actual place with actual income." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend it's what I imagined my life looking like. But I've been thinking that what I imagined my life looking like for the last 14 years was not a picture I was particularly happy with." She said, "Would you be happy here? Genuinely?" "Because I need you to answer that honestly." He considered it. She appreciated that he considered it rather than simply reassuring her. "I think I would be," he said finally. "I think I already am mostly. This is the longest I've been anywhere in 14 years. Every other time I've been somewhere this long I've been getting restless by now, looking at the horizon, thinking about the next place. I'm not doing that. I'm thinking about whether Brody's chimney needs reinforcing before winter, and whether the garden might produce anything next year if we put some work into the soil now, and whether you would marry me." The last sentence arrived without particular emphasis, tucked in with the chimney and the garden as though it were of equivalent practical importance. She stared at him. He looked back at her steadily. "That came out differently than I planned it," he acknowledged. "Were you planning it?" "For about 2 weeks. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She thought about everything. She thought about it quickly, the way she had always thought when the arithmetic was important, because this was the most important arithmetic she had been asked to do in some time, weighing one kind of life against another, weighing the real and provable against the feared. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes, yes," she repeated. "I will marry you, Quinn Jared, with the understanding that you do not get to make significant decisions about selling important things without discussing them with me first." "The horse," he said. "The horse," she confirmed. "Which we are going to find a way to get back, by the way. I have been looking into it, Vera." He was smiling, which she had not expected given that she was scolding him. "Emmett Farrow still has Cinder. I spoke with him last week. He bought the horse intending to resell him, but he hasn't found a buyer yet, and he mentioned he was open to offers." She looked at him directly. "Brody paid you last week. How much?" Quinn worked out the number. "About $4 after the room and board. I have $3 from the laundry work this month, and the payment is settled, so there is no other obligation. If we both—" She stopped. She heard what she was saying. "If we both combine what we have, we might be able to approach Farrow." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the surprised, softened laugh expression, or the careful listening expression, or even the quiet love expression she had been learning over the past weeks. This was something new. This was a man looking at a woman and seeing her with complete clarity and being overwhelmed by what he saw. "You've been planning to get my horse back," he said. "Since the day I found that note," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We." "What? You said if we both." "You said it before you caught yourself." She met his eyes. "I suppose I did. You've been thinking of us as a we," he said. "Before I asked you to marry me." "I've been thinking of us as a we since sometime in late August," she said, with more composure than she felt. "I simply wasn't ready to say it out loud." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. His hands were rougher than they had been in August, blacksmith's work having left its marks, and she thought irrelevantly that she liked the change, liked that he had been changed by this place, by the decision to stay. "Vera Briggs," he said, "you are the most practical romantic I have ever met." "I am practical," she agreed. "The romantic part is new." They went to Emmett Farrow the following Saturday with $7 between them, which was everything they had combined. Farrow was a broad man with a red beard who ran his trading post with a cheerful mercantile shamelessness, and who had sold Cinder to Quinn's horse fund in the first place, and therefore had some understanding of the context. He looked at the $7. He looked at Quinn, whom he had met briefly, and who was standing in his trading post with an expression of controlled hopefulness that he probably thought was not visible. $7 for an animal I paid $11 for, Farrow said. "You've had the cost of feeding him for 6 weeks, Quinn said. "And you haven't found a buyer. And I have a permanent position at Brody's Smithy, and I will send customers to you for as long as we are both in this town." Farrow thought about this. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a fair one, and something in the situation seemed to be registering with him beyond the pure transaction. "Who's this?" he asked, nodding at Vera. "This is Vera Briggs," Quinn said. "She is going to be my wife." Farrow looked at Vera. "You want to help this man buy his horse back?" "Very much," she said. Farrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, $8. "And I want it known around town that I made a fair deal." "Done," said Quinn. "We only have 7, Vera said quietly. "I have $1 I set aside," Quinn said quietly back. She turned to look at him. "From where?" "I've been setting aside $1 a week for 3 weeks," he said. "For exactly this." She stared at him. "I told you I checked the arithmetic," he said. She laughed then, the full and unguarded kind, in the middle of Emmett Pharaoh's trading post with the smell of leather and dried goods around them, and Pharaoh watched this, and his expression shifted into something that was not quite his usual commercial satisfaction. $8, he said. Go get your horse. Cinder recognized Quinn immediately. The horse was in the small corral behind the trading post, and when Quinn came through the gate, the stallion lifted his head and moved toward him with the unhurried certainty of an animal who has known a person for years and is not particularly surprised to see them again. Quinn put his hand on the horse's neck and stood there for a moment not moving, his forehead pressed against the side of Cinder's head. Vera stood at the fence and watched this, and felt something in her chest that was not quite the same thing as what she felt for Quinn, but was related to it. A tenderness for the connection between a man and an animal that had been his company through years of solitary and difficult movement across a country that was not always kind to either of them. Quinn turned and looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way that he was not quite managing to conceal. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it," she said, which made him laugh again. They were married in November at the Caldwell Methodist Church on a cold gray Saturday with a wind coming down from the north that made the ceremony feel brisk but not unpleasant. Mee Fuller was there and insisted on having strong opinions about the flowers. Hector Brody was there as Quinn's closest thing to a witness among men who had known him for more than 3 months, which said something about Quinn's prior relationship to staying that he acknowledged frankly in his vows. Clara Hicks cried in a way that suggested she had decided this was her doing and was pleased about it. Vera's sister, Eleanor Marsh, came down from Columbus. She was 2 years older than Vera and had been writing anxious letters since August about the situation. And she arrived 3 days before the wedding with the energy of a woman who has been worried at distance and is now here to inspect the source of her anxiety in person. She inspected Quinn over dinner at Vera's kitchen table on her first evening. Quinn, who had survived a war, years of bounty hunting, and various other dangerous situations, appeared to find Eleanor Marsh somewhat more nerve-wracking than most of these. Eleanor asked him, directly and without apparent concern for social convention, what his intentions were, what his income was, what his prior history with women had been, and whether he had ever been convicted of anything. He answered all of these questions honestly, including the last one, which the answer to was no, though he acknowledged it had come close twice. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Vera. Then she looked back at Quinn. "You sold your horse for her," she said. "Yes, madam." "And then you tried to get it back." "We got it back together." Eleanor was quiet. Then she said, "My sister has been through a considerable amount of difficulty, and she deserves someone who understands the value of what she is." "I know what she's worth," Quinn said. "I knew it before I knew her name." Eleanor turned to Vera. "He's staying," she said, as if this were her conclusion to reach. "He is," Vera said. "Good," Eleanor said, and passed him the bread, and that was apparently that. The wedding itself was simple and genuine, the kind that happens when 2 people are making a serious decision and do not need it dressed up. Quinn wore the cleanest shirt he owned, which was now a good shirt because Vera had purchased him one at the dry goods store and he had not argued about it. Vera wore a blue wool dress that Eleanor had brought from Columbus as a gift. They stood at the front of the church and said the words to each other. And when Quinn said the words, he said them looking directly at Vera with an expression that left no room for any interpretation, except the one it intended, which was that he meant every syllable and had thought about each one carefully, and was not afraid of any of them. Vera said her words back to him in the clear and steady voice of a woman who has made her calculations and is certain of her answer, and she felt, as she said them, the complete absence of the fear that had been her companion for so long. Not because the future was certain. It was not certain. Nothing in 1878 in southern Kansas was certain. But because she was facing the uncertainty with someone she trusted, and that made all the difference. Mee Fuller cried at the reception, which she denied doing. They spent their wedding night in Vera's house, which was becoming their house, and Quinn built up the fire against the November cold, and they sat together in front of it for a long time before either of them spoke. "Are you happy?" she asked. "More than I have ever been in my life," he said simply. "You?" She considered it the way she always considered important questions, with honest attention rather than reflexive reassurance. "Yes," she said, "I am happy. It still surprises me a little. Does it need to stop surprising you?" He asked. "No," she said. "I think I like being surprised by it." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and outside the November wind moved through the elm tree and the mockingbird was long since gone south for the winter, and inside the fire crackled and kept them warm. The winter was hard in the way Kansas winters are hard, which is to say comprehensively and without apology, but it was manageable in a way that the previous year had not been. Quinn's work at the smithy continued and expanded, Brody's trust in him growing through the fall into something that was genuinely approaching partnership. They talked about the livery stable plan with increasing specificity as the months passed. Vera's laundry work continued, and she added to it a small but growing bookkeeping practice, which had begun when Brody discovered that she had a gift for numbers and asked her to manage his accounts, and then mentioned this to other businesses on the street. And by December, she was keeping books for 3 establishments and earning more per hour than she ever had from laundry. "I told you mathematics would be useful," she said to Quinn one evening, entering numbers in Brody's ledger at their kitchen table. "You did," he said from across the table, where he was reading the Kansas newspaper. "You were right." "I am frequently right," she said. "Frequently is an accurate word," he agreed, turning a page. She threw a pencil at him. He caught it without looking up from the newspaper, which she found simultaneously impressive and irritating, and which made her laugh, and the evening continued. Elena wrote from Columbus that she was thinking of coming west permanently. She had met a farmer from Indiana at a church gathering and was corresponding with him, and found Kansas an increasingly interesting geographic option. Vera wrote back that Kansas was cold in winter and the bank manager had an unpleasant personality, but that the people were generally good, and the sky was extraordinary, and she would be very glad to have her sister closer. Spring came and Vera planted the garden again. She put serious effort into it this time, Quinn helping her on weekends, both of them learning as they went from a Mennonite neighbor named Anna, who had been farming this soil for 15 years, and had strong opinions about soil preparation and companion planting. By June, the garden was producing in a way it never had under Thomas's supervision, partly because of the rainfall and partly because Anna had fundamentally reorganized their understanding of what should be planted next to what. One evening in June, sitting on their porch after supper with the long warm light of the Kansas summer still present in the sky at 8 o'clock, Vera said, "I need to tell you something." Quinn set down his coffee. He could hear the particular quality of what she was saying, the careful tone of someone carrying news that is significant and uncertain. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him. "I believe I am expecting a child." The silence that followed was brief. He looked at her face, reading it with the attention he had always given her, the full and genuine attention that she had first noticed in a river on a summer afternoon and had never stopped being grateful for. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am more than all right. I am." She stopped, searching for the precise word. "I am very glad, if that is all right to say." "It is the best thing to say," he said. He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat together in the long summer evening with this new weight between them that was not heavy but lifting, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to rise. They told no one for another 2 weeks, keeping it to themselves in a way that felt like holding something precious carefully, before necessity and Vera's constitution made concealment impractical. Me Fuller knew before they told her, which was Me Fuller's particular gift, and not something either of them was surprised by. She appeared on their porch with a collection of knitted items and the information that she had a cousin in Wichita who had delivered over 200 babies and would be happy to come to Caldwell for the occasion if they needed someone better than Doc Halsey, whom she considered adequate for gunshot wounds but unreliable in matters of birth. They sent for Me's cousin, a capable and no-nonsense woman named Ruth Kimball, who arrived in late January of 1880 for the last weeks of the pregnancy and delivered, on a cold February morning that was coincidentally almost exactly 18 months after Vera had stood at the dry goods store with 37 cents and a wrong arithmetic, a son. A boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes and, according to Ruth Kimball, an extremely vigorous opinion about having been removed from where he was comfortable, which she said was a good sign. They named him Thomas Jared. Thomas for the man who had brought Vera west and loved her honestly if impractically, which was a history that deserved acknowledgement. Illy because Quinn had always liked the name, and it had belonged to a man who had been kind to him once, a long time ago, in a context he did not go into in detail, but honored in this small way. Quinn held his son on the morning of his birth, and stood at the kitchen window in the February cold with the baby against his chest, and an expression on his face that Vera, watching from the bed, would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward, and found it to be exactly the right place. The livery stable purchase came through in the spring. The previous owner, a man named Harold Ketch, who had been talking about retirement for 3 years, finally decided that 62 was old enough and accepted Brody and Quinn's combined offer with apparent relief. Quinn took over the operational management while continuing his work at the smithy, and within 3 months, the livery stable was running more efficiently than it had in years, which had a great deal to do with the fact that Quinn understood horses in a way that was more intuitive than learned. Vera's bookkeeping practice grew to include 7 businesses by the end of 1880. She hired a young woman named Ada who was 17 and quick with numbers, and had been educated to the limits of what the Caldwell schoolhouse could offer, and was hungry for more work than the town usually gave women. And Ada proved an excellent assistant, and eventually something approaching a protege. A leaner came to Kansas in the spring of 1881. The Indiana farmer, whose name was George Marsh, who turned out to be a quiet and thoughtful man well suited to a leaner's particular energy, had indeed chosen Kansas, and they settled on land 12 miles east of Caldwell and were married in the summer in a ceremony that was somewhat larger and more flower-intensive than Vera and Quinn's had been, because a leaner had been planning a wedding since approximately 1873 and was not going to be talked out of the flowers. Thomas Jared learned to walk in the summer of 1880 and spent the following year treating the world as a problem to be investigated at maximum speed and minimum caution, which kept both his parents variously entertained and terrified. He had a particular relationship with Cinder that Quinn observed with a satisfaction that was too deep for him to talk about easily. The horse was gentle with the child in the way that animals sometimes are with people who do not yet know to be afraid of them. And Thomas spent a portion of every day pressing his small face against Cinder's nose and apparently conducting a conversation whose content neither parent could interpret. The debt that had started everything was fully settled. The house had been legally purchased from Thomas's uncle in Wichita, with the combined savings of 2 working years, a transaction that Preston Holt at the bank processed with an expression of suppressed emotion that Vera chose to read as admiration, though she acknowledged this was probably optimistic. One Saturday afternoon in the early autumn of 1881, Vera and Quinn were sitting on their porch in the still warm September light while Thomas slept inside, and the garden was doing its final productive push before the frost. They had been quiet for a while in the easy way of people who have been together long enough that silence is simply another form of conversation. Quinn said, "Do you remember the note I left in the livery stable?" "I remember every word of it," she said. "I told you not to thank me." "You did." "I told you not to come looking." "You were wrong about that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about that," he agreed. "I was wrong about most of what I thought I knew about my life at that point. I thought I was doing a practical thing with practical consequences and then stepping out of your way. Instead you came looking," he said, "and everything after that is the best thing that has ever happened to me." She reached over and took his hand. His hands were calloused and strong, blacksmiths' and horse handlers' hands now, the hands of a man who worked and stayed and built things. She held it and looked out at the September sky over Caldwell, which was doing what the Kansas sky always did in late summer, deepening into colors that seemed too intense to be real, orange and rose and a deep dusty purple at the horizon. "I owe you $1, she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The first thing you ever gave me was a silver dollar on a railing," she said. "I never paid it back. Vera, that was 3 years ago, I'm aware. I keep careful accounts." She reached into her pocket and produced a silver dollar. She held it out to him on her palm. He looked at it. He looked at her. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: amusement and tenderness and something else that was purely private, the expression of a man revisiting a memory and finding it better than he remembered. He took the dollar. He turned it over in his fingers. Then, with a deliberateness that she recognized as the same deliberateness with which he had originally placed it on the railing between them, leaving her the choice, he set it down on the arm of her porch chair. "Consider it given back," he said. She picked it up. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Then I'll keep it," she said. "For our daughter when she arrives." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. Quinn said very carefully, "Vera." "Spring," she said. "According to Ruth Kimball's calendar, which she left with me for exactly this kind of calculation." He stared at her. Then he pulled her to him and held her in the September evening on their own porch in front of their own house in the town. They had both, for different reasons and by different paths, found themselves unable to leave. She pressed her face against the side of his neck and felt his arms around her and thought about 3 years ago, about 37 cents and a wrong arithmetic, and a silver dollar on a railing and a note in an empty stable, about the 1,000 small decisions and chances and stubborn acts of faith that had added up to this particular evening on this particular porch with this particular man. The arithmetic, finally, had come out right. Their daughter arrived in the early spring of 1882, on a March morning when the first tentative warmth was beginning to return to the Kansas air. Ruth Kimball came back from Wichita for the occasion and declared the baby perfect, which Vera and Quinn already knew. And Thomas Jared, 2 years old and deeply invested in the proceedings, stood at the bedroom door and stared at his new sister with the focused intensity of a person encountering something entirely new to their understanding of the world. They named her Clara Rose Jared. Clara for the sharp-tongued and eventually warm-hearted woman at the Methodist church who had watched a silver dollar on a railing and told her opinion about it, and had been converted into one of their most reliable advocates. Rose because Quinn had said it quietly one evening when they were considering names, and Vera had heard something in the way he said it that she knew was private and important and did not ask about. Simply agreed to, which was its own kind of understanding. Caldwell in 1882 was a different town than it had been in 1878. The cattle drives were beginning to shift north as the railheads moved, and the town was in the process of negotiating its future, whether it would become something settled and permanent, or whether it would fade as the cattle trade moved on. Quinn and Vera watched this negotiation with the interested attention of people who had decided their stakes were here regardless of what the cattle market did. The smithy and livery stable were established enough to survive the shift. People needed horses and metalwork, regardless of whether the Kishome Trail was busy. Vera's bookkeeping was essential to enough of the local businesses that her income was secure. They had a house and a garden and 2 children, and a horse and a neighbor who had strong opinions about companion planting, and a friend in me Fuller who appeared on their porch periodically with knitted things and news, and a look that said she had known how this would go from the beginning. One evening in the late spring, with Clara 5 weeks old and Thomas running in the garden under Alina's supervision, while Alina's husband George sat on the porch with Quinn discussing something agricultural that Vera was only half attending to. Vera stood at the kitchen window and looked out at all of it. The garden and the children and the elm tree and the porch and the particular slant of Kansas light in late afternoon, and thought about everything it had taken to arrive here. She thought about Thomas Briggs and his optimism, and the debt he had left her, and the 14 months of managing a loan and the drought, and the 37 cents, and the wrong arithmetic. She thought about a man she had not asked for appearing twice in the same afternoon, and a silver dollar on a railing and a river, and 2 hours of washing clothes. She thought about a note in a livery stable and an empty stall and the shape in the straw where a horse had been. She thought about how the most consequential things in her life had not announced themselves. They had arrived sideways, in the form of a coin left where she could take it or leave it, in the form of a man rolling up his sleeves to help with laundry he had not made dirty, in the form of a choice made quietly in the dark and left under a floorboard for her to find. Quinn came through the back door with Thomas on his shoulders, the boy shrieking with the particular delight of a child at altitude, and Quinn ducked through the doorway with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned the exact measurement of his own height relative to their door frame. "Supper?" Quinn asked. "Nearly ready," she said. He set Thomas down, who immediately demanded to know where the baby was, and Quinn pointed him toward the cradle in the corner, and Thomas went to stand over it with the same focused attention he had given it since the beginning. This small, fierce love he had developed for his sister, that was one of the more unexpectedly moving things Vera had observed in her life. Quinn came to stand beside her at the window. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She leaned into him slightly. "About arithmetic," she said. He made a soft sound that was not quite a laugh but was warm. "Does it come out right?" She looked at the garden and her children and the elm tree and the approaching evening and her husband beside her. And she thought about 3 years of building something real from the materials available, which had never been plentiful, but had turned out to be enough. "It comes out exactly right," she said. Outside, the evening settled over Caldwell, and the mockingbird came back to the elm tree, cycling through its borrowed songs. And inside the house, there was the smell of supper and the sound of a child's voice and the particular quality of warmth that exists in a place where people have chosen each other deliberately and kept that choice every day since. The silver dollar sat on the kitchen shelf, between the tin box of important papers and the jar of dried lavender from Anna's garden, where Vera had put it on the day Quinn had given it back to her. She had never spent it. She was not going to spend it. It was not money anymore, or it was money still but also something else. A record of a moment on a boardwalk in August of 1878 when a man had left a choice in the space between them, and a woman had reached out and taken it. That was how it had started. A coin on a railing. An act of care offered without condition, and received with caution and repaid eventually with everything. Quinn Jared had come to Caldwell for 3 days and stayed for the rest of his life, and not a day of it had gone the way he had planned, and every single day of it had been exactly right.